My topic for today is being Agile, Scrum, and XP. So this is a bit of a controversial topic because we all use Scrum over here, and I personally have used extreme programming before. So my name is Ankita Kulkarni, and I'm a developer here at Wrangle. I joined Wrangle a little more than 3 months ago, and so this is my first lunch and learn, so that's exciting. So thanks everyone for showing up. So just gonna give a disclaimer here that whatever I'm sharing of being Agile, Scrum, and extreme programming, I'm sure that we all have different experiences, but I have used both, and I'm gonna share a little bit of nuggets here and there about my experience, and also go over the major differences and how they are similar, but they are different. So let's go over that. So let's start with basics, like basics. So Agile Manifesto. Who here has heard about it? I'm sure everyone. Cool, awesome. I wasn't expecting so many people, but yeah, so you see a little ski icon there, and there's a reason for that. So on Feb 11 to 13, 2001, 17 people got together at a ski resort to basically eat and I think drink and ski. So that just because they wanted to talk about and come up with some sort of common principle, an agile manifesto for the industry there. And there was a lot of discussions and controversy and debates and everything, and they came up with a certain list of things that everyone in the industry today uses that. And two of the main, I shouldn't say main, but like two people that were mainly there were Jeff Sutherland, who was the inventor of Scrum, and also Kent Beck, who is the inventor of extreme programming. And they contributed a lot, and I guess since my topic is Scrum and XP, I think it was worth mentioning that. So the Agile Manifesto. If you Google Agile Manifesto, this is literally what you see. So the idea was that we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. We focus, while there is value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left. So for example, giving individuals and interactions more weight than over processes and tools. Similarly, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan. And like I said, the values in the items on the right are really, they are correct, but as part of the Agile Manifesto, we value the items on the left more. So now that we have covered the basics, we know what being agile means, so let's get to the second part of the talk. But before I do get to that, I want to mention about these core values. And these four things. Now, I'm just going to give a little bit of background of who I am and what I did before I came to Wrangle. So I worked at IBM as a software developer. And when I joined IBM, I was completely a new graduate. And at that point, I actually was working in a team where we used Scrum. Now, after coming to Wrangle, I see how Scrum is really done, because in the first team, I really didn't know what being agile meant and what Scrum was. But what did help me get through all those 4.5 years at IBM are these core values. I was working in a part of IBM after that team where we actually built custom client-facing apps, which was pretty cool. Now, when you talk, the clients are humans, right? Like, we all have emotions, we all go through a bunch of different things personally, and these are the core values that I think are what me got through. Empowerment, trust, transparency, and empathy. And empathy is a big one, because sometimes we might complain or we might rant about, okay, why was this decision taken in the first place? If you would do it right in the first place, you wouldn't have to do it again, right? But you never know what that specific client was in, what pressure the management was giving them, and who knows what else was going on that actually helped them take that specific decision. So you never know, and that's why having empathy is really, really crucial, and that helped me get through all my client experiences. And even though when some experiences were very challenging, when I took a step back and I was like, there's something else going on here. And that's when I got it, and we were able to build a better relationship as well. So now that I've gone through the core values that I follow, let's start with what is Scrum. Now, I don't need to give a definition of some sort for what is Scrum. Do I really need to? We all know what Scrum is, right? We all follow Scrum. We all use it in our projects, right? Okay. Yeah, that. So, Scrum is basically a flavor of Agile. We all know what Scrum is, and what I'll go throughout the presentation is I'll dig deep into, what are the differences, and that's when you sort of start seeing how Scrum is similar to extreme programming and how extreme programming is similar to Scrum, or what are the differences really. And before I start that, I think we all should go a little bit in detail on what is extreme programming. Now, as a speaker, for me, saying extreme programming feels really long, so I'm going to use XP, if that's okay. And this is something, a question that might come up, that is this some way of extreme way of programming or some sort of thing? And it's just like, no, sort of, no. So it is a flavor of Agile. And so a little bit of story again over here. When I joined Wrangle, as part of the introductory talk, I told people about where I was working and what process that I was following at IBM. And as part of that, I use acronyms such as XP. And a lot of people didn't know what XP was. That makes sense because it's XP. It could be literally anything. And when I clarified further about being at extreme programming, everyone was still like, I've heard of it, but I don't know what really is. And I got that response from so many of you that I thought that, why not do a lunch and learn talk? And I was literally like this guy over here trying to elaborate, how do I explain extreme programming in 2 sentences that they don't get bored of me? So, again, XP is also a flavor of Agile, but something I would definitely like to clarify over here is XP is more of an engineering practice. It is Agile, it is a process. You can still do XP while you do Scrum. And XP, like I said before, it was developed by Ken Beck, and he was the one who sort of came with a bunch of different engineering practices through his struggles 20 years ago. And he wrote a famous book, Extreme Programming Explained, which I will update a link in the slide as well. So what extreme programming means is that strong customer development process, good communication with the team, following pair programming, following test-driven development. The test becomes a documentation of your code. Okay, that's a lot of information I'm saying in one slide, aren't I? So I'm gonna go into how are they different first. So XP, now I put together this slide a while ago, and in my first team, we would never even think about having an iteration or a sprint less than 4 weeks. And that's the reality, because we literally were going from being waterfall to being agile, and for some reason, having a 1-week sprint was a really big thing at the time. That's why, on the other hand, XP is literally 1-week iterations. If you have an XP project with 2 weeks iteration, I can assure you that in the retro of that XP project, you're gonna be like, whoa, we need to set up a bunch of meetings to even clarify whatever the things that we are working on with clients. In XP, stories are pulled from continuous backlog. In Scrum, commitment made at the stories commitment made to stories at the iteration beginning. Now again, this is not true. We all do Scrum differently. And we have all, over here, it's a lot more different. There are 1 week iterations mainly, or 2 weeks if the client agrees or whatever. But developers are assigned stories at when the iteration begins or during the iteration. Although in XP, there's always an iteration. Stories are assigned when they are pulled. So imagine that a product owner goes through the bunch of stories, prioritizes them, and then all the developers have to get the stories as per the priority. And if you do have to pull up, let's say story number 10 from the backlog, you need to communicate that to the product owner and explain your reasons why. And this is how they're different. And this is like a strict comparison. Like, you know, like if you Google or if you ask anyone who has done Scrum and XP before, this is exactly what they're gonna tell you, or something close to that. So let's look at backlog. Sort of I said, you know, a bunch of points in my previous slide, but in Scrum, once a backlog has been made, you don't touch the backlog, that's it. Like you decide what's there in the sprint. Whereas in XP, it's pretty dynamic. So as long as a developer has not started working on the feature, the product owner can just come in, just like not use that feature at all, or change the direction completely. Story prioritization, and I think I mentioned this point already. The product owner decides what goes in the backlog and also the priority. So developers mainly have to literally go through the backlog one by one and get the stories done. And they don't have more of, you know, what exactly, what priority or whatever opinions in this matter, because the product owner knows the business side of things more. Whereas in Scrum, the product owner, even though they do put a backlog of items and they do set the priority, but it's up to sort of independent of the team on which order they want to execute them, essentially. So this is a very important topic in this slide deck, is team focus. So like I said, that XP is an engineering practice. So it does follow certain engineering practices, which is pair programming and test-driven development and stuff like that. So that's why in XP, the team follows more, so it's more so very strict. If you're following XP, these are the practices you should definitely adapt, or you sort of see yourself lagging behind or whatever, right? Whereas for Scrum, the team has to figure out the logistics on how they want to work together, what works best and stuff like that. So I like that it's actually more flexible, because you can sort of see how the client wants to work with you and what works and what not, and then you make changes at the same time being agile and not going too far away from the definition of Scrum. So let's take a look at XP a little bit more in detail. This is, when you think of extreme programming, this is literally the toolkit you should be looking for. Pair programming. I'll get to pair programming and test-driven development. I have separate fancy slides for that. And co-location. So pair programming and test-driven development really works well if you are not remote. And that's the reality of it. Like I can tell from my personal experience, at IBM, even though we tried, you don't know that even network, like internet, could be an issue for some people. And the network can go down. And when you're pairing and you're going, you have this nice flow, and it can just not work out. And that's the least, that should be the least amount of your worries, because you're actually building great software. And that's why you are in the room for. Continuous integration, continuous delivery. Again, I personally have noticed that in Scrum, we did not, initially in my team, we did not have, even though we had a continuous delivery pattern, we did not have a continuous integration pattern, just because we were too scared to show our client what we are building, because we didn't want bugs. Although that did happen, because we were really not following what being agile really meant or what Scrum really is. Small user stories, velocity, and weekly iterations. Now, small user stories, we all believe that, right? Smaller the user story, better it is, and the definition of story. So these concepts are very common between the both of them. So how does planning take in XP? And I'll also go through Scrum over here. Again, planning, we call something different in XP, but it's literally the same in Scrum. Like, it's just called differently, that's it. So inception, a project kickoff. You go meet the client on site, you discuss, you figure out the logistics, what's working for them, what's not working for them, figure out the goals and risks of the project. Now it really depends who the client is and if they really have an idea or if they don't have an idea and what they exactly want to build, right? You break down stories, and most importantly, you build a shared understanding within the team so that nobody leaves the room there thinking about, I don't know what we talked about, and that's not what we want. Again, inception only happens as the project kickoff at the beginning of the project. Similarly, for Scrum, we have a similar thing, the project kickoff that happens at the beginning. It's literally the same thing. Iteration planning meeting. So this is sort of like a Scrum ceremonies. Iteration planning meetings, since XP is strictly 1 week iterations, I'm going to say IPM, because why not? Now you guys know what iteration planning meeting is. So IPM happens once a week. Whoops. And you break, again, in IPM as well, you break down stories, you build a shared understanding. But one thing you do differently here, you also estimate points. Now, in the inception, in the first week, you also write stories, and you do some story pointing there, but IPMs are mainly for writing stories. One thing I should definitely mention is that the product owner is not encouraged to write stories for the entire project. Just because it's so dynamic that requirements can change, so you only build stories, you only write stories for the next couple of weeks, or the next week rather, and then you put those items in the backlog. Anyway, roles. Roles are my favorite, and you'll see why in the next slide. So, roles. Apologies for the cute animated photos or whatever of animals, and it's, yeah. So, let's go through all the 3 roles. So the main roles in XP, and when I say developers, I'm also including architects and QA together. So just wanted to clarify that. And the idea is that there are designers, there's product owner, and there are developers. And developers don't go with the strict definition, it's just developing something. So developers, the reason why there are 2 dogs here is because it's XP, that means you're pairing, right? And they look alike, because more often than not, you actually do look alike when you sort of start coding together. Anyway, designer, who's a very cute hamster, and is much more fancy because designers know how to make everything look beautiful. And product owner, I hope there are no product owners here, but yeah, so this cat, yeah. Anyway, so all the 3 of them are wearing hats. And that's because the idea is that you do have to sometimes share hats. Sometimes you want to collaborate with the designer to figure out what's working best for the client. Sometimes you learn more often than not, you actually learn a lot of things from the product owner about how the business is going. Because as a developer, it's really crucial that you do know that. So the product owner owns the what, the architects, developers, QA own the how, and the designers own the wow. Thank you. So, Scrum roles. So who is that additional animal over here? I'm sorry for calling you an animal, but it's just, I don't know. So, is a Scrum Master. Now, when this photo came in, you're like, oh, wait a second. Who does the role of a Scrum Master in XP then? So like I said, it's more of an engineering practice. That's why the team itself are responsible sort of bits and parts of the Scrum Master's role. And even though it can get really challenging, and I personally prefer having a Scrum Master just because when I was working on projects where we were actually doing XP, some of the projects I was leading, and the whole thing came on me to actually figure out the logistics with the client, resolve any conflicts or anything of that sort. And I felt at the time that I just wish I could just think about code. Like I said, I'm a developer, so I just wish I could do that without worrying about all this. But the advantage is that the first couple of weeks it does feel like a lot, but as the project goes along, the number of things you have to do reduces. For example, once you schedule meetings for the next 3 months, you don't have to schedule them again. But in the first week, you do have to. Anyway, let's go through all the roles here. Product owner is fully empowered to make decisions on behalf of the business. They do run the iteration planning meeting, and they do run, specifically, like they do run every meeting sort of, because they're the one who are the key role in the project, because without them, we won't know where to go. They write and prioritize stories, they answer any questions, and stuff like that. And this is true for Scrum and XP both, and that's why I haven't mentioned this is specifically for Scrum. This is specifically XP. And they also look at analytics. Next one is the designer. They validate the MVP. They work with the developers to bring the wireframes to life. They also write CSS code sometimes just to make sure that the developers get it, what we are doing, and stuff like that, right? So like I said, hats are shared. So it's really crucial to know that sometimes you can act as a developer, sometimes you act as a designer, or sometimes you act as a, no, you don't act as a PO. Let the PO do the PO thing. And user testing and iteration on design. Developers. Developers, again, architects, testers, QA, developers. Architects investigate and figure out what the key technologies or if there are any hurdles in the team that they're facing. In XP, you do focus on pair programming. That's why the dogs are in pairs here, but you also test drive. You ask any questions in the team, but you collaborate and you work together. And lastly, the Scrum Master. I personally feel Scrum Master is a very, very crucial role, even though in XP it's really the team doing it. And just because it's not very defined, it becomes harder to say who's doing what. But again, Scrum Master coaches the team, the product owner, and the business on how the process is going to work. They jump in at any time and figure out, if everything is going as per the process, if something should be tweaked. They're the ones who would come in for that. They'll keep an eye on any sort of anti-pattern, and they protect the team by doing anything possible so that they focus on delivery. So, pair programming. So, who here has done pair programming before? That's awesome. Like, that's very cool. Okay, so like I said, one of the engineering practices in pair programming is pair programming in XP. And in pair programming, the way it works is that one role is a navigator and other is a driver. So literally, if the navigator is writing, basically the navigator is navigating and pointing out any mistakes in the code or any bugs that you might encounter when you're writing the code. But the idea is that the driver would actually write the code and make sure that they communicate with the navigator and both of them together come up with a common solution. So I think this process does speed up a lot, just because you don't want to write code and according to me, like, you don't want to write code, submit a PR, and then you get some feedback and you work on it. This goes back and forth. But just because there are two sets of eyes on the same problem, the same story, it really helps a lot because you avoid a lot of the mistakes that you might do individually. Or they might say something like, let's use this common utility that your client is using that you might not know. So this is how a day in the life of pair looks like. So again, very similar to Scrum, except pairing. So what's the story you're working on? In the morning, there's a stand-up. 9:15 is just a time. It is obviously, it depends on when you want the stand-up. Again, what's the story? Who's pairing? And the idea is also that you switch pairs. That way you get to work every day with different people, right? Now, if you're working on different stories, then if you're working on the same story and you haven't finished the next day, You can then stick with the same pair to avoid any friction. But again, you can switch pairs after that story gets done. That way you actually get to work with different people. And I personally can tell that when I joined my second team at IBM, where we actually followed XP and being agile and all of that stuff, I was such a newbie that I did not know a lot of things. I paired on a project and I learned so much, not just in terms of how to write code, but also in terms of what cool tools that they use, what's the keyboard shortcuts that they have, what techniques do they have, and they learn some things from you that you don't even know you had. So you sort of feel empowered that, yeah, like we did this. And again, this is something that I face as well, is that if it happens that a bug does get detected in your code, if they do find bugs in your code, then you're together. You're not alone. So you both are looking at the problem together and trying to solve it. Ping pong is something I'll get to in my slides, but ping pong here means you play ping pong because we all need breaks, right? And then at the end of the day, you definitely commit code so that it goes through the whole CI/CD process. Sorry, continuous integration, continuous delivery process. Shouldn't use acronyms. Okay, test-driven development. Test-driven development literally means that. Red, green, refactor. And this does require a little bit of a mindset shift because you're like, I don't know what code I'm gonna write. Like, how the hell why should I waste time writing tests? Like, why do I do that, right? But I personally had a hard time with that, with test-driven development initially as well as a developer. But then when you start writing tests, you sort of understand that you're not writing tests for some weird code that you don't even know you're gonna write. You start thinking, okay, this is the story. How do we wanna split it up? If you split it up into, let's say, 3 parts, the first part, what needs to be done in that specific thing? Okay, maybe you need a function or of some sort, right? And then you write a test to make sure. And using the test, you're actually designing your thinking to do that. And I know test-driven development can be a lot of information here, and I can totally get that. That's why I think test-driven developers should be a next Lunch and Learn topic in the future. Anyway, so you write the test, and the idea is that you make them fail, and then you write the code to make the test pass, and then now that you have made all this mess with the code, clean it up and refactor. So when you're writing the test, you're literally sort of doing brute force way. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you're doing it? Because now you do have a test that's working. So when you do refactor, you have all these tests that can sort of be the documentation of your code. And the main thing about test-driven development that I think that I still use in my job, even though I'm not doing TDD right now, is that do the simplest thing first that works. What's the most simple thing that you can actually do in this specific story or in this specific part of your story? Just do that. And when that works, move on to the next simplest thing, and so on. So again, like I said, write tests, make them fail, and then make them pass. And personally, I was I was so happy. Like, I personally felt that, yeah, like how I'm progressing in my story, there are already well-covered tests. I don't have to worry about, oh, now I have this code working, let's go and write tests after, and then realize, oh, shoot, I'm gonna break this other thing, and then go back to the code. So that really helps a lot. So if you wanna be this, use TDD. I'm kidding. So well-tested codes do have fewer bugs just because you're writing tests. And the main thing over here is that in XP, the idea is that the tests become the documentation of your code. And that for me is like, yes, I don't have to write documentation after that. Yes, but with the way not all the clients are as agile thinking as you are, so they are like, but what if you encounter and what if you do encounter some bugs and the engagement is done? So you do have to write some sort of documentation, but then you keep explaining them that, yes, there is documentation. Read your tests, and you'll know what the documentation is, right? So the tests become the documentation of your code. Something that I like to follow even now is that, let's say I do write the code, and there is a bug afterwards. Now you know the bug. You fixed it. Now let's write a test for that. So now it's documented. So in future, nobody can come and ask, did you really fix that? Yeah, I did. Look at the test. I have a documentation for that. It's sort of like tracking, and it also helps with the client a lot more, because with client relationships, everything is so transparent that you want to be telling them about this specific thing about writing tests as a documentation and stuff like that. And it does save a lot of money for them as well, because they're paying less so that you don't have to write more documentation. But in my experience, there was a specific client who just did not get it, who did not get that test was a documentation. They're just like, no, but I want to see everything written down. And then they had to pay an additional week of engagement with us just so we can finish writing all the documentation. Now, even when we were writing all the documentation, we were just like looking at the test, and we were just copying from our test and just making it look pretty and using the right words so that everyone can understand. And at the end, they were super happy, and that's what matters, right? Makes clients happy. So there is research around this. So whatever I'm saying, even when we were using XP at IBM, I did go through internal training with using XP and stuff like that, but the teachers over there were actually following these two books. Again, the Pair Programming Eliminated, which is a great book if you want to learn more about pair programming, and Extreme Programming Explained by Ken Beck is also a great book. So my past experiences, this experience is mainly with a specific client that I worked with, and again, I cannot take any names just because of confidentiality reasons, but I can tell that they were actually using Scrum in their teams. And they really loved Scrum. They knew exactly what they were looking for, and they were really technical. So they just enjoyed what they were doing. So when they came to us, they came to us more so like, okay, how does XP work? Let's see what are different agile processes and see what works for us and what doesn't. But the big problem there was that I was pairing with the client developers, and each one of them had a huge skills gap. For example, one developer did not exactly know HTML, but we were building a React application. So when I was pairing with them, and it's okay to not know, don't get me wrong here, it's okay, it's totally cool. But when I was pairing with them, I sort of had to go through the basics of what anchor tag means. And that to me was like taking a lot longer to get the story done. And at the end of it, they just did not like pair programming, because there was a way senior developer on the team, on the client side, who just wasn't in the mindset of mentoring, and that's when it just goes down. But I know that I wrangle. Whoever I've met so far are really awesome, and everyone wants to teach everyone, and it's a very open culture. So I know that it can happen with clients, but it will most likely not happen here. So that's where it failed. So what did we actually do to make that relationship successful? And what we basically did was that we actually made sure that we asked them, so what's working for you? Why do you like Scrum so much? Like, what don't you like? So they did like test-driven development. They loved it, that they don't have to write documentations, because let's say everyone is lazy. They don't want to write documentation. They don't want to pay us more money. So that makes sense. So that was justified. But they didn't like pair programming just because of the huge skills gap. And so what we did was we basically took whatever, and they did like that in XP there's a simplistic design pattern and stuff like that, and something called as chores, which I won't get to in detail, but mainly like tasks. So everything is tracked, essentially, even though these are not really user stories. And they really like that. And we got everything together, and we just tweaked the process and embedded that into Scrum. And they really loved it. They were really happy with that. They were happy that we were so agile and just modifying all the process itself. Excuse me. And this is one of the quotes that I really like. Even programmers can be whole people in the real world, which I forget sometimes. I don't know. XP is an opportunity to test yourself, to be yourself, to realize that maybe you have been fine all along and just hanging with the wrong crowd. Now, even though Ken Beck does mention about XP being an opportunity to test yourself, I would say like that basically applies to just being agile if you do it right? But I personally, especially in my first team where we did use Scrum, I personally did find a huge crowd difference when I moved into the agile world, just because everyone knew what they were wanting and stuff like that. So, in my experience, what are the challenges of XP? XP does not work well for remote teams. Like I've already mentioned that. Since there are really strict engineering practices, it becomes really, really challenging to actually convince the client to use this, because their mindset is that, well, why do I pay for 2 developers working on one story when 1 developer can be working on one story and other can focus on the other one? But as you start using it, you start realizing the importance of it. Your code is your documentation, and the management might not like that based on my client experience. And there's a huge culture shift in the organization with pair programming. So that itself, very interesting. Okay, back. So there's a huge culture shift with pair programming. And again, one feedback I did get was one developer did not like being watched by other developer, and that does happen because you always want to put your best side in front of everyone, right? And that's why that can happen, but it can be intimidating as well. So again, second client experience, and then lastly about Scrum improvements that I think could improve the Scrum. Anyway, past experience. This one was a very successful engagement. This client didn't know what they wanted. They came to us. They actually followed, again, they were using Scrum in their organization, so they knew what Agile means, but they didn't know exactly what they wanted in terms of what they want to build. They came with us. They were super excited. They loved it because the entire team, within a period of 1 week, knew exactly how to do front-end development. And at that point, I was doing full-stack development with the client. So they exactly learned the whole process of what front-end development is, what back-end development is, what does it take to actually deploy the app to the cloud. And they loved all of that. They really loved it. And because of that, it was a really successful engagement. And at the end, we also got a good client reference for that. The management did give a feedback that it would take a lot longer with skill sharing between the team if they did not use this approach. And it became a lot easier as well. So, last slide. Scrum improvements, and this is just my feedback, essentially, right? Like, I worked with both, and I've worked at Wrangle on a couple of projects already, and I personally feel what could actually improve. We don't have to change and use from Scrum to XP just because I gave this talk, but we can embed certain engineering practices from XP, such as pair programming and test-driven development, and sort of change your mindset slightly towards that and being open to it, right? So we do move developers and people between the teams all the time. And I think when they do move, even when I moved into a new team who was already working on existing code, I thought that, maybe this might be a good time to actually pair with someone, work on a story. That way I can ask all the questions I have, and it doesn't have to be the most experienced person in the team. It could be someone who has slightly more experience than you do at that point. And that's where I feel pair programming can really help. It can help onboard new members, and also you can work on really difficult problems together. So you don't have to just keep a developer alone on their own to actually work on certain specific problems. And I think it can also help when pairing can also happen between designers and developers, or QA and developers to debug a certain thing or show the scenario and stuff like that. So you can actually use that a lot. And again, test-driven development can be used for unit testing your code. They become documentation. You can always point out even the QAs or anyone on your team to point to that specific test. And it really helps a lot. And you yourself will find that, I don't know how this function works. I don't remember after a few months, or a couple of months, or even a week for me. And that's when you go back and you test, this is what I did, and this is how it works. So, having said all that, thank you. So, thanks everyone for coming. I don't know why it does that. But thanks everyone for coming and listening to the talk. Hope it was useful. If you do have any questions regarding the process, if you want to try something out from what I mentioned, please feel free to reach out to me, Slack me or whatever. I'll be happy to answer any questions. So that's it. Thank you. Yeah, I would like to, one last thing I would like to say is that I want to give a shout out to Hussein, because when I did prepare my slides for Lunch and Learn, I sent it to him, and he was very, very nice. He was really nice, and he always reviewed my slides, and we went back and forth, going from finding the right emoji and stuff like that. So, if anyone needs help from me, or Hussein, although I'm volunteering him, please reach out. Anyway, thanks. Yeah. Everybody, yeah. Everything.